Hello, you're watching Addleshaw Goddard's Employment Channel. In this week's programme, we're looking at unfair dismissal and some of those thorny issues that can crop up on a regular basis. Is it fair to use competency tests to select for redundancy? What about dismissing employees on long-term sick leave when occupational health recommend a phased return? And let's not forget about the ACAS Code. We all try to follow it, but will messing it up a bit mean that a dismissal's unfair? We see what the EAT thought. Finally, we leave you with a shark's tale, an employment news story that's making waves on both sides of the world at the moment. Our first case today then is Bozzoli and Food Partners Limited. Here the EAT had to decide whether a dismissal was fair even though the employer hadn't followed the ACAS Code to the letter. Mr. Bozzoli was a driver. He'd already received a final written warning for failing to report for work after having too much to drink. His employer's disciplinary policy stated that this warning would stay live for 12 months and that any further breaches of conduct during that time would result in dismissal. Unfortunately, he went on to crash his company vehicle, causing over £6,000 worth of damage. After investigating, his employer invited him to a hearing, decided enough was enough and dismissed him. Mr. Bozzoli claimed that this was unfair because his final written warning hadn't warned him that further breaches of conduct could result in dismissal. His existing final written warning hadn't been mentioned during the disciplinary hearing, and his invite to that disciplinary hearing hadn't warned him that he might lose his job. Both the tribunal and EAT found that Mr. Bozzoli was fairly dismissed, although his employer hadn't followed the ACAS Code line for line here, because employees should always be warned before a disciplinary hearing if they might lose their job. The EAT concluded that it was still obvious from the employer's disciplinary policy that his final written warning could have resulted in him getting the sack further down the line. Also, he hadn't raised any of these objections when he'd first appealed against his dismissal. Overall, the EAT agreed with the tribunal that it was correct to look at the employer's procedure in the round when considering compliance with the ACAS Code. So a good result for Food Partners here then, but what implications does this have for other employers? I'm joined by Emma Whiting, a partner in our employment group, to shed some light on this.
Thanks, Helen. I think this is a really interesting case and certainly a timely reminder for employers as to what constitutes good practice when it comes to dismissals. For me, there were three important points to arise from this. The first was the importance of written warnings. Certainly a well-drafted written warning should warn the individual of potential consequences of future misconduct. Particularly in relation to final written warnings, it should be very clear on the face of the document setting out how long that warning is going to be for, what the consequences are for the individual, i.e. dismissal, if they were to breach that warning during the period that it's live. Strangely, the employer in this case hadn't done so, and maybe if they had, then we wouldn't be talking about this case now. The second point is in relation to disciplinary procedures and the importance of well-drafted and clear procedures. For the employer here, it was their saving grace because they'd breached the ACAS Code of Practice. But also, I think it's important that they had indeed followed their own procedure to the absolute letter, and certainly that's what we'd always advise in cases like this. And then finally, the ACAS Code of Practice, as I've hinted at already, they hadn't followed that in this particular case, which was a very serious breach, obviously, and one which could, in another constituted tribunal, have resulted in a finding of unfair dismissal. So, on the one hand, that they might have been viewed as being lucky in this case, but certainly in terms of good practice and our advice, we'd always say that a disciplinary policy should be dovetailed with the ACAS Code of Practice and one be very much complementary to the other.
Thanks, Emma. So operating under a better safe than sorry approach seems to be the way forward here. But whilst the company in that case got away with relying on internal policy and procedure, the next employer wasn't quite so lucky. So in our next case, is it fair to use competency tests to then select employees for redundancy? Here, like many employers, a hospital was facing the difficult task of selecting staff for redundancy. Wanting to avoid subjective decisions, they included a competency test used in recruitment as one of their 3 selection criteria and gave it more weight than the other 2 criteria, which was sickness and disciplinary. Employees completed a written test, interview and group exercise, all with HR staff that they'd never worked with before. Past appraisals weren't referred to, and the employees' line managers also weren't consulted. The result? Probably not too hard to guess. It was very surprising, with the hospital actually admitting that some good workers were selected for redundancy. At tribunal, the claimants were successful in claiming that they'd been unfairly selected for redundancy, but the hospital appealed to the EAT. So what did the EAT think? Well, they criticised the employer's approach to selection. They thought it was unusual to have a recruitment method as a selection tool without referring to past appraisals or what line managers thought. They also found confusion and inconsistency in the marking criteria because some assessors had marked between 0 and 5 and others between 1 and 5. Overall then, they agreed with the tribunal that the process was unsatisfactory. The employees had been selected in an unsuitable manner and their dismissals were unfair. Once again, we go to Emma for her insight on this case.
Thanks, Helen. It's a particularly unusual case, I would say, on the facts. It's not common for an employer to, in effect, use a recruitment tool as a basis for a redundancy selection process. But I think more generally, the two important points that I certainly took away from this case are as follows. The first is that line managers should really be consulted during any redundancy selection process. They are the individuals at the end of the day who know the affected employees best. They're the ones who've seen their work on a day-to-day basis and so can best assess whether or not they are fit for purpose and the business going forward. To have not done so, as in this case, leaves you wide open for challenge. The second point is of wider application, that is in relation to the design of any redundancy selection process. Using a competency framework of itself isn't an issue. However, where it is weighted such that it becomes the material and determining factor, it does mean that that particular facet of the process has to be completely watertight and very much reasonable and fairly applied. In this case, it wasn't. Had they had, and this is certainly what I would advise, a much more broad-ranging selection process, then the opportunities for litigation would have reduced, as would the risk.
Thanks again, Emma. So it seems that if you find yourself needing to make redundancies, stick to a common sense approach and make sure that you involve the employees' managers. Our last case today then is Jennings and Barts and the London NHS Trust. Was an employer justified in dismissing an employee after a long period of absence, even where occupational health had recommended a phased return to work? Well, Mr Jennings was dismissed after 9 years working for the Trust. During that time, he'd been off work a lot for various reasons, and the Trust had eventually disciplined him under their short-term absence policy. As is so often the case, this led to more absence due to stress, and many meetings were then rearranged, postponed, or eventually held in Mr Jennings' absence. It was at one of those meetings that Mr Jennings was put into the Trust's long-term absence policy without notice, which was actually in breach of the Trust policy. In January 2008, at a final meeting under that long-term absence policy, the Trust eventually dismissed Mr Jennings, deciding that his continued absence was unfair to colleagues, his department was under pressure, and that he might never return to work. However, this was despite the fact that his last occupational health report suggested that he might be ready for a phased return just 2 months later, in March 2008. The tribunal concluded that Mr Jennings' dismissal was procedurally fair. Despite the Trust's breach of policy when they placed him in the long-term absence scheme, the tribunal concluded he'd had plenty of other chances to challenge this. The Trust's decision to dismiss wasn't premature because occupational health reports are often positive and optimistic, and Mr Jennings himself was actually pessimistic about returning in March, asking for more time and suggesting that he couldn't cope. The tribunal also rejected his claim for failure to make reasonable adjustments. What about the EAT then? Well, they agreed with the tribunal, finding that this wasn't a borderline case because Mr Jennings' absence record was particularly poor, and his absence for 100 days in the past 8 months justified the Trust deviating from some of their policies. Also, as Mr Jennings' idea of a reasonable adjustment was complete exemption from the Trust's short-term absence policy, the EAT thought that the Trust had acted fairly by not making these adjustments. This would have been a bridge too far. So, another good result for the employer here. This case certainly reminds us that employers are only under a duty to apply reasonable adjustments, with the emphasis on the word reasonable. In terms of unfair dismissal, where there's a particularly poor absence record over a period of time and evidence that the employees themselves doubt their ability to return to work, tribunals are more likely to view the employer's actions within the reality of that situation. And finally for today, I'll leave you with this thought: fair or unfair? An employee with 10 years service who made the news back in January for shark wrestling on holiday in Australia has now been sacked. Why? Well, Mr. Marshalsea and his wife were both on sick leave from work for stress when, on the advice of their doctor, they took a 2-month holiday to Australia. Halfway through a beach barbecue, Mr. Marshalsea spotted a shark in the shallows and leapt up to wrestle it away from some vulnerable young children. The full drama was captured on video though and soon made its way to YouTube, where it went viral. He was heralded a hero. However, it wasn't long before his employer found out, who wasn't aware that he and his wife were on holiday. They have now both been dismissed, with the employer referring to a breakdown in confidence. But it does look like this one could be heading for the nearest tribunal. It's not clear what the employer's reason for the decision was, as holidays are often tonic or therapy for stress. It's perhaps because the Marshalseas failed to let their employer know about their holiday. Keep a lookout for this one though. It's bound to be hitting the news sometime soon. Anyway, that's all for this week. Thank you for watching Addleshaw Goddard's Employment Channel, and see you next time.